0700 hours. July 8, 1944, northern Saipan. At the base of the jagged Banaderu cliffs, a single U.S. Marine stands completely exposed in the open. He isn't aiming a rifle. He isn't calling in a coordinates for a naval bombardment. He is waiting. Private First Class Guy Gabaldon, 5'4", 130 pounds, is staring up at a tactical nightmare that defies every doctrine of the United States Marine Corps. Hiding inside the honeycomb of dark volcanic caves directly above him are over 800 soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army. They are armed, starving, and culturally programmed for Gyokusai, the act of shattering like a jewel through suicide rather than accepting the shame of capture. Any other Marine would have called for a flamethrower tank to seal the caves. But Gabaldon knows that fire will only trigger a mass suicide event, killing hundreds of women and children trapped inside with the soldiers. So, he is attempting the single most dangerous gamble in the Pacific Theater. He is trying to capture an entire enemy battalion, alone, using the only weapon the Corps didn't issue him, his voice. If he flinches, he dies. If he speaks the wrong dialect, they all die. To understand how an 8-year-old street rat from East Los Angeles found himself in this impossible standoff, we have to go back to the beginning. The road to that impossible standoff began 3 weeks earlier, on the 15th of June, 1944, when the invasion fleet turned the horizon into a wall of gray steel. For the United States, Saipan was a strategic necessity, an unsinkable aircraft carrier, sitting just 1,300 miles from Tokyo, perfectly positioned for the new B-29 Superfortress bombers to rain fire on the Japanese mainland. But for the Japanese defenders, Saipan was something far more sacred. It was the first piece of actual imperial soil to be invaded. To lose Saipan was to lose face before the emperor, and in the moral calculus of the Imperial Japanese Army, that was an outcome strictly forbidden. The defense of the island was built around a doctrine known as Gyokusai, literally translated as the shattering of the jewel. The concept was poetic, but the reality was gruesome. It demanded that the garrison destroy itself in battle, rather than accept the spiritual pollution of surrender. Every soldier, from the highest-ranking general to the lowest private, was expected to fight until his ammunition was gone, and then use his last grenade on himself. General Howland Mad Smith, commanding the V Amphibious Corps, met this fanaticism with the standard Marine Corps solution: overwhelming kinetic violence. The tactic was brutally simple, known in the manuals as Blowtorch and Corkscrew. It worked like a grim assembly line. First, infantry would pin down the cave entrances with heavy machine gun fire. Then, combat engineers or specially modified M4 Sherman tanks nicknamed Satans would roll up to the cave mouth. These tanks didn't fire shells. They fired streams of napalm-thickened fuel through a flamethrower mounted in the gun turret. The operator would trigger a 5-second burst, sending a jet of liquid fire roaring into the darkness, instantly sucking the oxygen out of the cavern and incinerating everything inside. From a military standpoint, the tactic was effective. It cleared the caves. But from a psychological standpoint, it was a disaster. The Japanese commanders had spent years indoctrinating their troops and the civilian population with a terrifying lie that the Americans were not soldiers, but sadistic monsters, American devils, who would rape women, torture men, and eat children. When the Marines unleashed the flamethrowers, turning entire families into charred remains inside those caves, they weren't breaking the enemy's will. They were confirming the propaganda. The tragedy culminated at the northern tip of the island, at a place called Marpi Point. By early July, the Japanese forces had been pushed to the precipice. Thousands of soldiers and civilians were trapped between the advancing Marines and the 800-foot drop into the jagged rocks and churning ocean below. The Marines stopped firing, hoping to accept a surrender. They brought in loudspeakers. They dropped leaflets promising food and water. It didn't matter. The fear was too deep. From his observation post, Private Gabaldon watched a scene that would haunt the collective nightmare of the Marine Corps for decades. He saw mothers, terrified by the stories of American brutality, take their infants in their arms, walk to the edge of the cliff, and jump. He saw fathers push their children off the ledge before leaping after them. He watched entire families huddle around a single hand grenade, pull the pin, and vanish in a cloud of pink mist. The water below Marpi Point turned red. The bodies bobbed in the surf like driftwood, so thick that Navy patrol boats couldn't navigate the waters without their propellers fouling on the dead. This was the failure of the blowtorch. You could kill the enemy with fire, but you couldn't kill the idea that drove them to die. The standard U.S. intelligence officers tried to intervene. They brought Nisei interpreters, Japanese Americans, to the cliff edge to plead with the survivors. But these interpreters spoke High Japanese, the formal, academic dialect taught in universities or used by the upper class. To the terrified, starving conscripts and farmers huddled in the caves, this formal language didn't sound like safety. It sounded like the police. It sounded like an interrogation. It sounded like a trick. Gabaldon watched the interpreters fail. He watched the flamethrowers roar. He watched the bodies pile up in the surf. And amidst the stench of death and cordite, something snapped in the young private. He realized that the entire American military machine was fighting the wrong war. They were fighting a physical war against a psychological enemy. They were trying to use physics to solve a problem of culture. He knew that if he stayed on the line, following orders, he would just be another cog in the meat grinder. He would shoot men who didn't need to die. He would watch more children jump from cliffs. The system, the massive, bureaucratic, firepower-obsessed structure of the U.S. military had no answer for Gyokusai. But Guy Gabaldon did. He possessed a weapon that General Smith and the entire Pentagon Strategy Council lacked. It wasn't a new rifle or a bigger tank. It was a specific set of sounds, a specific cadence of speech, and a specific understanding of the human heart that he hadn't learned in boot camp. He had learned it on the rough, diverse, impoverished streets of Boyle Heights, East Los Angeles. And he knew that to use it, he would have to break every rule in the book. To understand the weapon Gabaldon brought to Saipan, you have to understand that he was technically an enemy of the state before he even put on a uniform. Guy Gabaldon wasn't born into the military aristocracy. He was a street rat from Boyle Heights, East Los Angeles, one of the few neighborhoods in 1,930 seconds, America, where the segregation lines blurred into a chaotic, vibrant survival struggle. He was a short, scrappy kid, fourth of 7 children, who spent more time shining shoes on Skid Row than he did in a classroom. By age 12, he was practically raising himself. But his life took a sharp turn when he drifted into the orbit of the Nakano family. They were Japanese Americans, immigrants trying to carve out a life in a country that viewed them with increasing suspicion. Guy befriended their twin sons, Lane and Lyle, and eventually, he did something that was socially unthinkable at the time. He moved in with them. For the next 6 years, Guy Gabaldon lived as a Japanese son. He slept on tatami mats. He ate miso soup and rice. He didn't just observe the culture, he was absorbed by it. And crucially, he learned the language. But he didn't learn the Japanese taught in military academies or diplomatic schools. Those institutions taught Keigo the rigid, honorific-laden, High Japanese used by officers and aristocrats. It was a language of distance, hierarchy, and submission. Guy learned Zokugo. He learned the rough, clipped, slang-heavy patois of the streets. He learned how to insult someone, how to joke, how to complain about the weather, and how to talk about girls. He spoke the dialect of the fisherman, the shopkeeper, and the farmer, the exact demographic that made up the bulk of the Imperial Japanese Army's conscript infantry. When Pearl Harbor shattered the world in 1941, the U.S. government tore Gabaldon's world apart. Executive Order 9066 sent the Nakano family, his family, to the Heart Mountain internment camp in Wyoming behind barbed wire. Guy, being genetically Caucasian, was left behind. He was a man without a home, furious at his government, but desperate to fight. He joined the Marine Corps, and when the recruiters realized he spoke Japanese, they fast-tracked him to the intelligence section of the 2nd Marine Regiment. But from the moment he arrived in the Pacific, it was clear that PFC Gabaldon was a glitch in the military matrix. The standard U.S. Marine Corps interpreter was an officer who stood safely behind the lines, broadcasting formal surrender demands over a loudspeaker. To a terrified Japanese private hiding in a cave, hearing that formal, aristocratic Japanese booming from the sky was terrifying. It sounded like the voice of their own abusive officers, or worse, the cold voice of a foreign conqueror demanding submission. It reinforced the us versus them narrative. Gabaldon offered something heretical, us versus the war. He realized that his specific dialect was a psychological key. When he spoke, he didn't sound like a conqueror, he sounded like a brother. He sounded like the guy who sold them fish back in Hiroshima, or the neighbor who fixed their bicycle in Osaka. His rough, unpolished Japanese bypassed the soldier's military conditioning and spoke directly to the human being underneath the frightened kid who missed his mother and just wanted a bowl of rice. This duality created a civil war of the heart inside Gabaldon. As his landing craft churned toward the beaches of Saipan, he wasn't just seeing enemy targets. In every shadow, in every cave, he saw the faces of Lane and Lyle Nakano. He saw his foster parents. He knew that the men hiding in those hills weren't the samurai monsters of American propaganda. They were men like the Nakanos, trapped by a code they couldn't escape and a government that demanded their suicide. While other Marines sharpened their bayonets to kill Japs, Gabaldon was preparing to save his brothers. He realized that the most effective weapon against the Bushido code wasn't a flamethrower. It was empathy, weaponized through the slang of the East LA streets. But to deploy this weapon, he would have to go rogue. The Marine Corps didn't do empathy. They didn't do negotiation. And they certainly didn't let 8-year-old privates wander unarmed into enemy territory to have a chat. Gabaldon didn't care. As the sun set over the smoking ruins of Saipan, he stripped off his helmet, the symbol of the American invader, and put on a civilian baseball cap. He slung his carbine over his shoulder, grabbed a pocket full of cigarettes, and slipped into the darkness of the jungle, leaving the safety of the American perimeter behind. He was walking away from the war he was ordered to fight and walking straight into the one he was born to win. But to the United States Marine Corps, this unauthorized excursion wasn't heroism. It was a court-martial offense. When Private Gabaldon dragged his first 2 prisoners back to the perimeter wire at dawn, 2 terrified Japanese stragglers he had talked out of a spider hole, he wasn't greeted with a medal. He was dragged before Captain John Schwab, the commanding officer of the headquarters and service company. In Schwab's eyes, Gabaldon wasn't an intelligence asset. He was a dangerous liability. He was a loose cannon who had abandoned his designated post in a combat zone to play a private game of hide-and-seek with an enemy known for feigning surrender to detonate hidden grenades. The friction here was structural. The Marine Corps is a machine built on discipline, redundancy, and the chain of command. Gabaldon was operating on instinct, improvisation, and solitude. Captain Schwab looked at the scrawny 18-year-old and saw a disciplinary nightmare, a kid who likely had a death wish and was going to get a squad killed trying to rescue him. Schwab threatened to throw the book at him. He threatened the brig. He threatened to strip him of his rank. But Gabaldon slammed a counter-argument onto the table that no officer could ignore: the intelligence. The 2 prisoners he had brought back weren't just warm bodies. They were talking. Because Gabaldon had treated them like human beings, sharing his cigarettes, speaking their street dialect, and binding their wounds, they were spilling the locations of mortar pits and sniper nests that the division's official interrogators couldn't pry out of anyone. Schwab was stuck in a paradox. He couldn't officially sanction a teenager wandering off into the jungle alone, but he couldn't deny the tactical gold mine Gabaldon was excavating. So, the captain made a decision that would seal Gabaldon's fate. He authorized him to operate as a lone wolf. It sounds like a cool nickname, but in 1944, it was a death sentence. It meant 0 support, no radio to call for artillery, no fire team to cover his flank, no medic to patch him up. If Gabaldon got into trouble, he was on his own. The Corps was effectively washing its hands of his survival while eagerly accepting the fruits of his labor. Liberated from the constraints of standard regulations, Gabaldon began to refine his weapon system. He realized during those first few nights that his appearance was sabotaging his diplomacy. To a Japanese conscript peering through the jungle canopy, the silhouette of an American M1 steel helmet was the universal symbol of the American devil. It triggered an automatic, Pavlovian, kill or die reflex. The helmet didn't say negotiator, it said invader. So, Gabaldon did something unthinkable for a frontline infantryman. He threw his helmet in the mud. He replaced it with a battered civilian baseball cap. He took off his heavy combat jacket. He slung his M1 carbine low, barrel pointed at the dirt, held loosely in one hand like a hunter walking through the woods, rather than a soldier clearing a room. The visual transformation was psychological genius. When he emerged from the brush, he didn't look like the terrifying colossal Marine from the propaganda posters. He looked like a kid. He looked like a confusing, non-threatening anomaly. This visual dissonance created a OODA loop jam in the enemy's mind. The Japanese soldiers would see him and hesitate. Is he a civilian? Is he a scout? Why is he wearing a baseball cap? That split second of hesitation was the window Gabaldon needed. Before they could resolve the confusion and pull the trigger, he would hit them with the voice. "Why are you dying for nothing? The war is over here. Come have a smoke." He wasn't shouting demands like an officer. He was talking like a gangster, protecting his turf, firm but familiar. He was positioning himself not as their enemy, but as a mediator between them and the crazy Americans with the flamethrowers. He was the double outsider, too Mexican for the white Marines, too American for the Japanese, existing in a lethal no man's land where he was the only translator of intent. Night after night, he refined the craft. He learned to read the silence of the caves. He learned that if a cave was quiet, they were listening. If he heard crying, they were breaking. If he heard the distinct click-clack of a Nambu pistol bolt, he had less than a second to dive. By July 7th, he had brought in dozens of prisoners. But he knew it wasn't enough. The Banzai charge on the Tanapag Plain had left thousands dead, but thousands more were retreating north to the cliffs. The suicides were accelerating. The lone wolf realized that picking off stragglers one by one was like trying to empty the ocean with a spoon. He needed a wholesale victory. He needed to break the back of the Gyokusai mindset in one massive stroke. And that is how, on the humid morning of July 8th, with his captain's reluctant permission and his baseball cap pulled low against the glare, Guy Gabaldon walked away from the safety of the American lines and stood alone at the base of the cliffs, staring up at the dark mouths of the caves, preparing to bluff his way into history. The bluff began in a silence so heavy it felt like physical pressure. Gabaldon stood at the base of the Banaderu cliffs, a solitary figure on a stage of black volcanic rock, staring up into the darkness of the cave mouths. He was effectively standing in the kill zone, a tactical space where he had zero cover, zero concealment, and 1,200 eyes watching him from the shadows above. If a single Japanese soldier decided to pull a trigger, Gabaldon would be dead before the sound of the shot reached his ears. He didn't shout. He didn't wave a white flag. Instead, he deployed the first stage of his psychological pyramid scheme. He turned to the two prisoners he had captured earlier that morning, small, emaciated men trembling with fear, and gave them a simple order in their own street dialect. "Go up there," he told them, gesturing to the cave mouth. "Tell them the American army is behind this rock. Tell them we have the flamethrower tanks. Tell them if they walk out now, they get water and food. If they don't, I give the signal, and we burn the mountain." It was a lie of massive proportions. There was no army, there were no tanks. There was just one teenager with a carbine and a distinct lack of water. But the lie was calibrated to target the specific nightmare of the Japanese defenders. They didn't fear death, they had already accepted that. They feared the blowtorch. The two prisoners hesitated, looking at the caves, then at Gabaldon, then back at the caves. They knew the officers inside might behead them for cowardice. But Gabaldon offered them a cigarette and a nod. It was a small human gesture that cut through the military programming. They turned and began the slow climb up the goat path. Gabaldon waited. For 20 minutes, the only sound was the wind hissing through the sawgrass and the distant thud of naval artillery pounding the southern airfield. The sun beat down, turning the humid air into a suffocating blanket. Gabaldon leaned against a boulder, casually smoking, forcing his body to project an air of absolute boredom. Inside, his heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. This was the micro-tension standoff. Every second that passed without a gunshot was a victory. Every second was also a potential trap. Then, movement. At the mouth of the largest cave, a figure emerged. It wasn't a terrified conscript. It was an officer. He wore the full imperial uniform, despite the heat, and a gunto, a samurai sword, hung at his hip. He stood at the precipice, looking down at the lone figure in the baseball cap. This was the moment of critical mass. The officer was doing the math. He was looking for the trap. He scanned the brush line for the glint of American scopes. He looked for the tanks. He saw nothing but Gabaldon. The officer descended the path, moving with a stiff, dignified gait. He stopped 10 feet from Gabaldon. The visual contrast was absurd. A representative of the ancient samurai code facing off against a kid who looked like he should be delivering newspapers. The officer's hand rested on the hilt of his sword. "Where are your troops?" the officer demanded, his voice tight. Gabaldon didn't flinch. He looked the officer in the eye and doubled down on the bluff. "They are waiting for my signal." Gabaldon replied in perfect, rough Japanese. "I told them to hold fire because I wanted to give you a chance. But the general is impatient. You have 5 minutes before the flamethrowers start." He pointed toward the horizon, where the American fleet sat like gray steel giants on the water. "The ships are already targeting these coordinates. Don't make me kill your men." The officer stared at him. He looked at the ships. He looked at the caves where hundreds of his men were starving, rotting, and waiting to die. The cognitive dissonance broke him. The lie offered an honorable exit. They weren't surrendering to a boy. They were surrendering to overwhelming, compassionate firepower that had generously paused the slaughter. The officer bowed. A curt, sharp nod. He turned back to the caves and shouted a command that echoed off the canyon walls. The result was a geological event. It started as a trickle 5 men, then 10. Then the trickle became a flood. Japanese soldiers poured out of the caves like water from a broken dam. They came out carrying the wounded on makeshift stretchers. Civilians emerged, blinking in the harsh sunlight. Mothers clutching babies, old men leaning on bamboo staffs. Gabaldon watched, stunned, as his bluff materialized into a logistical nightmare. He had expected maybe 50 men. Within 30 minutes, he had over 800 enemy combatants sitting in formation at the base of the cliff. Now, the danger inverted. Gabaldon was no longer in danger from the Japanese. He was in danger from his own side. He had to march this massive column back to American lines. To a nervous Marine patrol spotting this through binoculars, it wouldn't look like a surrender. It would look like a massive, coordinated banzai counterattack. Gabaldon organized the column. He placed the officer at the front. He positioned himself at the very head of the formation, the only barrier between 800 Japanese souls and the trigger fingers of the 2nd Marine Division. They marched. The column stretched for over a quarter of a mile. As they rounded a bend in the coastal road, Gabaldon saw the inevitable. A U.S. Marine machine gun team set up behind a log barricade. The American gunners froze. They saw the massive enemy uniforms. They saw the rifles still slung over Japanese shoulders. Gabaldon hadn't had time to disarm everyone. The gunner racked the bolt on his Browning M1919. "Hold fire," Gabaldon screamed in English, ripping the baseball cap off his head and waving it frantically. "Don't shoot. They're prisoners. Don't shoot." The gunner hesitated. His finger took up the slack on the trigger. He was looking at an army of devils marching straight at him. Standard doctrine said, "Open fire, mow them down." Gabaldon ran forward, sprinting into the machine gun's field of fire, putting his own body directly in the path of the muzzle. He was the fuse on a bomb he couldn't defuse. "I'm an American!" he screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "I'm PFC Gabaldon. These are my prisoners." The gunner squinted. He saw the utility uniform. He saw the desperate, waving kid. Slowly, agonizingly, he lifted his finger off the trigger. The barrel of the Browning lowered. The silence that followed was louder than any explosion on Saipan. Gabaldon collapsed against the sandbags, gasping for air, as the Pied Piper of Saipan delivered an entire battalion without firing a single shot. But as the shocked Marines began to process the prisoners, the real war, the war of paperwork and prejudice, was just beginning. The silence that followed the lowered machine gun didn't last long. It was instantly replaced by the logistical roar of a rear echelon in panic. Within minutes, the perimeter at the Banaderu Cliffs transformed from a quiet observation post into a chaotic holding facility. Jeeps skidded to a halt, kicking up coral dust, as military police officers jumped out, batons ready, staring in disbelief at the sea of Japanese field caps and sun-bleached uniforms. Supply clerks scrambled to find enough water cans to hydrate a battalion-sized element that wasn't supposed to exist. And amidst the shouting of orders and the grinding gears of transport trucks, Captain John Schwab stood with his hands on his hips, looking at the lone wolf, who had just single-handedly solved the division's biggest tactical headache. The threat of a court-martial evaporated instantly. You don't court-martial a private who just captured more enemy combatants in one morning than the entire division had taken in 3 weeks of fighting. But the true value of Gabaldon's heresy wasn't just the 800 men sitting on the sand. It was what was inside their heads. The regimental S2 section military intelligence descended on the scene like vultures. Usually, S2 officers on Saipan had a grim job. They spent their days sifting through blood-soaked pockets of dead soldiers, looking for diaries or maps that hadn't been burned. The Japanese doctrine of Gyokusai meant that intelligence almost always died with the soldier. Secrets were taken to the grave, leaving American commanders blind to the next ambush. Gabaldon handed them a miracle, a living, breathing command structure that felt morally obligated to cooperate. The Japanese officer Gabaldon had bluffed on the cliffside was a man of his word. He believed he had surrendered under an honorable truce to save his men from the flamethrower bombardment. When the American intelligence officers tried to interrogate him using their formal, aggressive, high Japanese, the officer clamped up. He sat stone-faced, the wall of Bushido slamming back into place. The S2 officers were frustrated. They were screaming name, rank, and serial number. They were getting nowhere. Gabaldon stepped in. He dismissed the officers with a look that bordered on insubordination and sat down next to the Japanese captain. He offered him a light. He spoke in that same rough, familiar Zokugo dialect. He didn't ask for secrets. He asked about the officers' responsibility to the wounded men in the transport trucks. He framed the intelligence not as betrayal, but as a logistical necessity to ensure his men were safe from friendly fire. The wall crumbled. The officer asked for a map. For the next 2 hours, the lone wolf, translated as the Japanese commander, drew red circles over the northern sector of the island. He pinpointed hidden mortar pits that had been hammering the 4th Marine Division for days. He revealed the location of sniper spider holes camouflaged so perfectly that Marines were walking right past them before being shot in the back. He detailed the tunnel networks connecting the remaining defensive lines. This was actionable intelligence of the highest order. It was the difference between walking into a kill zone and dropping a precise 105mm artillery shell on the enemy's breakfast table. The ripple effect was immediate. Based on the intel Gabaldon extracted, American artillery coordinators adjusted their firing solutions. That afternoon, devastatingly accurate barrages slammed into Japanese positions that had been invisible just hours before. Marine rifle companies advancing north found their paths cleared, the enemy bunkers suppressed before they could fire a shot. The math of war is usually cold and abstract, but here it was visceral. Every red circle the Japanese officer drew represented a squad of Marines who would go home to their families instead of being buried in a temporary grave on Saipan. By the time the sun set on July 8th, the magnitude of Gabaldon's achievement was undeniable. The capture count kept climbing. Emboldened by his success and the validation of his methods, Gabaldon went back out. And then he went out again. Over the course of the Saipan and Tinian campaigns, Private Guy Gabaldon was personally credited with capturing approximately 1,500 Japanese soldiers and civilians. To put that number in perspective, Sergeant Alvin York, the most famous hero of World War I, captured 132 Germans. Gabaldon had captured 10 times that number. He had effectively removed an entire enemy regiment from the board without expending a single magazine of ammunition. He had proven, definitively, that the fatal flaw of the American war machine, its reliance on brute force, could be patched with cultural empathy. He had shown that a kid from the barrio could do what a fleet of battleships could not. But in the military, doing the impossible often creates more enemies than friends. While the Marines on the line cheered him, the high-level bureaucracy, the system, was viewing the reports with a skeptical, almost hostile eye. A 5'4" Mexican-American teenager showing up the entire V Amphibious Corps? It didn't fit the narrative. It didn't fit the poster. And as Gabaldon lay on a stretcher weeks later, bleeding from a machine gun wound he took while trying to save yet another group of strangers on Tinian, the paperwork for his recognition began its slow, treacherous climb up the chain of command. It was a journey that would prove far more difficult and far more heartbreaking than the climb up the Banaderu cliffs. The enemy in the caves had surrendered. The enemy in the Pentagon would not. The war in the Pacific did not end for Guy Gabaldon with a parade or a handshake, but with a 7.7mm machine gun rammed through the wrist and leg on the island of Tinian. While attempting to negotiate yet another surrender, this time with a cornered Japanese detachment hiding in the thick jungle brush, Gabaldon was cut down by a hidden Nambu gunner who refused to listen. He was dragged to safety by the very Marines who had once called him a liability, evacuated to a hospital ship, and shipped home. His war was over, but the battle for his legacy was just beginning. And this time, his opponent wasn't a fanatical emperor worshiper, but a rigid, segregated military bureaucracy that didn't know what to do with a hero who didn't look like a hero. Captain John Schwab, the officer who had initially threatened to court-martial Gabaldon, had become his fiercest advocate. Schwab understood the math. 1,500 enemy combatants removed from the battlefield meant 1,500 fewer rifles firing at his Marines. He drafted the paperwork recommending Private First Class Guy Gabaldon for the Medal of Honor. The citation was clear. It detailed the solo missions, the intelligence gathered, and the unprecedented capture of the 800 on July 8th. It moved up the chain of command until it reached the desk of General Holland, Howlin' Mad, Smith. General Smith was a legend, but he was a blunt instrument. He believed in attrition, in storming beaches, and in the supremacy of the rifleman. When he looked at the report of a 5'4" Mexican-American teenager who claimed to have captured a regiment with nothing but street talk, the general balked. Whether it was racial prejudice common to the era, simple disbelief at the sheer numbers, or a distaste for soft tactics like negotiation, Smith made a unilateral decision. He crossed out Medal of Honor. He downgraded the award to a Silver Star. There was no appeal. There was no public outcry. In 1944, a Latino kid from East LA didn't have the political capital to fight a 3-star general. Gabaldon took his Silver Star, pinned it on his chest, and went back to a civilian life of obscurity, driving trucks and working odd jobs while the country celebrated the clean narrative of the war. The insult to his identity was compounded 16 years later when Hollywood finally decided his story was worth selling. In 1960, Allied artists released Hell to Eternity, a blockbuster film based on Gabaldon's exploits. But when Gabaldon sat in the theater to watch his own life unfold, he saw a strange reflection. The man playing him wasn't a scraping, dark-skinned kid from the barrio. It was Jeffrey Hunter, a 6-foot-tall, blue-eyed, Scottish-American heartthrob. The studio executives had decided that a Mexican-American hero wasn't bankable. They whitewashed his ethnicity, turning the specific struggle of an outsider into a generic, all-American action movie. They kept the deeds but erased the man. Shamed by the publicity of the film and the obvious disparity between Gabaldon's actions and his Silver Star, the Department of Defense hastily upgraded his award to the Navy Cross in 1960. It was the second highest valor award in the nation, but it still wasn't the star. It was a consolation prize designed to make the problem go away. But the tragedy of Guy Gabaldon's denied Medal of Honor isn't just about a piece of metal or a ribbon. It represents a fundamental failure of the U.S. military to recognize a revolution in warfare. What Gabaldon invented on the fly in the caves of Saipan is what modern special forces now call human terrain analysis. In 1944, the prevailing doctrine was purely kinetic, a physics equation of force. If the enemy has a bunker, you apply X amount of explosive to destroy it. Gabaldon was practicing asymmetric warfare. He understood that the enemy's center of gravity wasn't their bunker. It was their belief system. By weaponizing empathy and cultural fluency, he hacked the enemy's operating system. He proved that one man who understands why the enemy fights is more lethal than a battalion that only knows how to shoot. This lesson was ignored. Because the military dismissed Gabaldon as an anomaly rather than a pioneer, the U.S. Armed Forces spent the next 30 years trying to solve cultural problems with firepower. From the rice paddies of Vietnam to the streets of Fallujah, American commanders repeatedly faced enemies who wouldn't break under bombardment, relearning the hard way that you cannot kill an ideology with an airstrike. They needed 1,000 Guy Gabaldons. They had flamethrowers instead. The final, bitter bureaucratic twist came in 2006. After decades of lobbying by Hispanic veterans groups and historians who verified the 1,500 prisoner count, the case for Gabaldon's Medal of Honor was reopened. The evidence was irrefutable. The racial bias of 1,944 was acknowledged, but the Pentagon rejected the upgrade. Their reason? The statute of limitations. They argued that too much time had passed to properly vet the witnesses who had been ignored in 1944 because of their ethnicity. The bureaucracy used its own past negligence as the justification for its present inaction. Guy Gabaldon died in August of that same year. He was buried at Arlington, surrounded by the honor he had earned, but denied the recognition he deserved. He went to his grave knowing that he had saved more lives, both American and Japanese, than perhaps any single private soldier in the history of the United States, and that his country was still too stubborn to admit that a street rat had outsmarted the generals. But history has a way of correcting the record, even if medals do not. The Manual on Warfare has been rewritten, and today, every Marine officer studying counterinsurgency learns the principles that an 18-year-old boy discovered alone at the base of the Banaderu Cliffs. He taught us that sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't to pull the trigger, but to drop the helmet, walk into the darkness, and speak. If you believe that true heroism shouldn't be forgotten just because it doesn't fit the right image, then help us keep this story alive. Hit that subscribe button right now. The algorithm buries stories like Guy's, but your like and comment bring them back to the surface. Share this video with someone who needs to know that history is more than just what's written in the textbooks. I'm the military history architect, and I'll see you in the next briefing. That definition of bravery, the willingness to walk unarmed into the kill zone, didn't just earn Guy Gabaldon a medal. It earned him a permanent place in the soul of the island he helped capture. Decades after the last 7mm round was fired, and the rusty hulks of the Satan tanks were swallowed by the jungle vines, Gabaldon returned to Saipan. He didn't go back as a conqueror on a victory tour. He moved there. He packed up his life in the United States, leaving behind the country that had downgraded his heroism, and set up a small seafood business on the very coast where he had once watched bodies wash ashore. For 20 years, the Pied Piper lived among the people he had liberated, and it was on those cliffs that the true vindication of his heretical solution finally materialized. Japanese tourists, often the children and grandchildren of the soldiers who fought there, would visit the Banaderu cliffs to pray for the spirits of the dead. There, they would sometimes encounter an elderly Mexican-American man with a limp and a baseball cap, looking out over the ocean. When they realized who he was, the reaction wasn't anger. It was reverence. They wept, they bowed, they thanked him. Because of Guy Gabaldon, their fathers hadn't died in a senseless suicide charge. Because of him, they had been born. The street rat from East LA hadn't just captured 1,500 prisoners. He had preserved 1,500 bloodlines that continue to this day. He proved that while the system treats enemy soldiers as statistics to be erased, a true warrior treats them as problems to be solved. The bureaucracy may have denied him the Medal of Honor, hiding behind statutes and timelines, but the living, breathing generations of Japanese families who exist today because he chose to talk instead of shoot are a decoration far more permanent than any star General Smith could have pinned on his chest. But while Gabaldon was using silence, slang, and cigarettes to save lives on the ground in the Marianas, 3,000 miles away in the cold, thin air over Europe, another American soldier was facing his own impossible mathematical disadvantage. He was a B-17 tail gunner named Michael Donovan, and he was about to find himself alone, separated from his formation, with 12 German Messerschmitts lining up to turn his bomber into a sieve. Gabaldon's solution was to stop the shooting. Donovan's solution was to invent a firing tactic so aggressive, so suicidal, and so technically wrong that it would rewrite the manual on aerial gunnery. We're going to strap you into the tail gunner's seat for that adrenaline-fueled nightmare in our next briefing. To make sure you don't miss the moment Donovan pulls the triggers, click that subscribe button and ring the bell right now. The algorithm tries to bury these stories of tactical innovation, but you can keep them alive. If you think Gabaldon deserved the Medal of Honor, leave a comment below saying, "Upgrade the star. I'll see you in the turret." Dismissed.